So the beginnings of this research were really motivated by the practical question about this idea that if you have some type of action you need somebody to undertake that you can't, directly easily measure. So the classic example is, truck drivers, how they drive or how they maintain their trucks. The idea from the literature is that, well, that individual should own the asset in question that they're using. That way they internalize any of the costs that could come from, example, from speeding or not maintaining your equipment. The challenge is, though, is just talking to practitioners in many different industry settings, they really didn't agree with that argument. They said, well, something's missing here. And talking to folks, it really became apparent that what seemed to be missing is the fact that that idea that you will internalize these sort of externalities may not apply if by, taking action like maintaining your equipment, if that keeps you from using the equipment today. And so essentially there's this pressure that if you are essentially reducing your productivity today or reducing your output today, people may not abide by sort of the traditional predictions that come about through property rights theory of the firm. And so that was really the topic we sought to explore in this paper using the motor carrier setting as a context. So when it comes to the research, so this was sort of a two-part project that came about from merging together a lot of primary survey data that was collected in 2011 with archival data on trucking company safety that came from the US federal government, and focusing on how rapidly firms improve compliance with different safety metrics following a substantial shift in regulations in the end of 2010. And in particular, what we looked at is whether firms that essentially outsourced a lot of their transportation capacity to independent contractors, whether those firms showed less rapid improvement in compliance levels, which is a very important practical question because a lot of industry participants, such as shippers and brokers, will utilize that safety data in order to, target new carriers for business. And so if you're not improving as rapidly, that could put you at a competitive disadvantage.
And even more broadly, a lot of firms are, shifting to using independent contractors in general for a variety of things. So, these findings and how do firms get independent contractors to comply to, these actions that are harder to contract about or to monitor, we thought, had broad implications outside of that.
Yeah, so the key finding from the paper was essentially focusing on how we would expect that firms that relied on independent contractors, they would show slower improvement in compliance on performance or on metrics for the independent contractor to improve performance. So for example, for maintenance, they would have to sacrifice near-term production. And so what we really focused on was this idea that in our context, independent contractors, they tend to avoid speeding violations because those really increase your probability of accidents and they open you up for very, very, very expensive fines. And it increases the likelihood that a carrier will terminate their relationship with you. So we expected that this change in regulation, whether you used independent contractors or not, really wouldn't affect if firms could improve performance. However, for two other metrics that, complying with hour of service rules, so in other words, how much could you work, we expected there would be substantial challenges that firms using independent contractors would face in getting those drivers to change their behaviors because complying with hour of service rules can substantially reduce your output. The same for maintenance activities, and that to maintain your trucks, you're going to have to shut down operations, and independent contractors are going to avoid doing that. So really the key finding focused on sort of this differential rate of moderation and building a statistical model to actually test that out.
In the kind of in the aggregate, we assumed that driving doesn't really get you much more. You're not able to do a whole lot more business if you're speeding. Whereas if you have to take your truck down for a day for vehicle maintenance, you lose a whole day's worth of business. And changing those actions, being able to change your independent contractor's actions are difficult or different across those metrics for that reason.
So I think when we think about future implications, as one is the angle that we took by identifying this sort of key factor that really hasn't been considered that much about whether actions are essentially going to reduce somebody's output and whether that actually may sort of mute the incentive of an asset owner to undertake those actions. That has very broad implications in settings such as, franchising, because in a lot of ways, independent contracting and franchising are fairly related to each other. So it would seem that there's a natural extension to explore this in other settings. For example, fast food would be a good example, and issues like compliance with quality, restaurant hygiene standards. There would be a lot of application potential, especially in a world where, as Keith mentioned, we're increasingly moving towards independent contracting in a lot of sectors. And I would imagine COVID may even heighten that movement even further. And so, sort of understanding these broad implications and challenges that firms face with managing a network of independent contractors, especially when a lot of the activities you need those independent contractors to do may not be something that directly leads to them making more income.
And then on top of that, there's a lot of policy implications. If you're looking for people to change these behaviors, understanding that different actions are going to be able to be changed or be able to modified easier than others probably kind of impacts how to structure policy to make some of these changes, especially in industries that are much more heavily rely on independent contractors than others.